The Belgian Malinois had 85 pounds of muscle, 4 years of combat training, and its teeth locked 6 inches from a surgeon's jugular. Blood was pooling across the trauma bay floor. A 4-star general was coding on the table. 12 armed Marines had their weapons up, fingers hovering, and nobody, not the chief of surgery, not the head of security, not the soldiers who'd trained with that dog for 3 years, could get near him. Then the quiet new nurse walked through the door. She said 2 words. The dog sat down. And every person in that room realized they had no idea who she actually was. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where I want you. Follow this channel so you don't miss a single part. Hit like if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it really started. The snow was coming down sideways when Nora Halstead pulled into the parking lot of Callaway Regional Medical Center for the first time. It was 5:50 in the morning. The lot was half empty. The building was a 12-story concrete block with blue-tinted windows and an ER entrance marked by 2 orange cones and a hand-lettered sign someone had taped to the automatic door. She sat in the car for a moment with the engine running, her hands loose in her lap, watching the snow collect on the windshield. She wasn't nervous. That was the strange thing. She'd been nervous exactly once in the last 6 years, and it hadn't been before a job interview or a first day at work. The memory of that particular moment wasn't something she revisited voluntarily. She turned off the engine, picked up her badge lanyard from the passenger seat, and got out. Callaway Regional served the eastern edge of Fort Carlo, Colorado, a mid-sized city that existed, as far as Nora could tell, primarily because the army base nearby needed somewhere for its people to buy groceries and get their cars fixed. The hospital had 400 beds, a level 2 trauma center, and a reputation for being perpetually understaffed. The recruiter who'd called her 3 weeks ago had said the words competitive pay and immediate start twice each. Nora hadn't asked many questions. She just needed a place to land. The woman at the nursing station on the ground floor looked up when Nora walked in. Mid-50s, reading glasses pushed down her nose. The particular expression of someone who had been managing other people's incompetence for so long, it had become her default setting. New hire. Nora Halstead, trauma and emergency. The woman looked at her badge photo, looked at her face, handed back the lanyard. Sandra Pruitt, charge nurse, days. You're on with me. She didn't smile. You had trauma rotations at your last placement? Yes. Where? Nora had rehearsed this. The answer she gave was the truthful part of the truth, the part that wouldn't require follow-up questions. Civilian contract work, mobile trauma units. Sandra looked at her for a second longer than necessary, then turned back toward the desk. We'll see if that translates. Follow me. The emergency department at Callaway Regional was shaped like a horseshoe, with the nursing station at the curve and exam bays fanning out on both sides. On the left were the lower acuity cases. Lacerations, fractures, the kinds of things that took time but not urgency. On the right were the trauma bays, separated by a heavy door with a small reinforced window. There were 4 of them. Nora noted the crash carts, the defibrillators, the positioning of the supply cabinets relative to each bed. She noted it the way she always noted things, set quietly, quickly, without making it visible. Sandra introduced her to the morning crew with the efficiency of someone reading from a checklist. Marcus Webb, the senior ER attending. Jess Okafor, RN, who gave Nora a distracted wave from across the station. A traveling nurse named Dylan, something whose last name Nora didn't catch. And Dr. Renee Callaway. No relation to the hospital's founder. She said it preemptively, the way people do when they've explained the same thing 1,000 times. The department chief who happened to be walking through at that moment with a coffee cup and a phone pressed to her ear. Dr. Callaway glanced at Nora, glanced away, kept talking into the phone. That was fine. Nora wasn't here to make an impression. She was here to do her job and keep her head down and not give anyone a reason to ask the kinds of questions she didn't want to answer. The first 4 hours were straightforward. She worked a fractured radius, a pediatric asthma case, 2 lacerations that needed suturing, and a 60-year-old man with chest pain who turned out to have costochondritis, but insisted it was his heart. She moved efficiently. She didn't talk much. She anticipated what the doctors needed before they asked for it, kept her notes tight, and stayed out of the way of the staff dynamics she hadn't mapped yet. By 10 a.m., Jess Okafor had stopped ignoring her. "You're fast," Jess said, refilling her coffee beside the station. Not a compliment exactly, more like an observation she hadn't decided what to do with yet. "Long shift rhythms," Nora said. Jess looked at her sideways. "Where'd you work before this?" "Mobile units, some contracted ER work." "Where, though?" "Different places." Nora picked up the next chart. "Mostly overseas contracts." Jess opened her mouth, then apparently decided not to push it. "Overseas contracts," she repeated. "Okay." She picked up her coffee and walked away. It was the third time that morning someone had reacted to Nora that way, with that particular rhythm of starting a question and then pulling back from it, like there was something about her answers that didn't quite land, but they couldn't identify what. She was used to it. She'd gotten good at giving answers that were technically complete and somehow unsatisfying, which was exactly the effect she was going for. What she was less good at was the particular variety of institutional politics that seemed to run the department like an invisible current beneath everything else. She figured that out around 11:30 when Marcus Webb, Dr. Webb, as everyone called him, with a slight emphasis that wasn't quite reverence and wasn't quite irony, came back into the trauma bay where Nora was finishing up a post-op check on a patient with a sutured thigh laceration. He didn't knock, which nobody in an ER knocked, so that was fine. What was less fine was the way he looked at her chart, then at the patient, then back at the chart, with the expression of someone looking for an error they were confident existed. "Halstead," he said. "Dr. Webb, you ordered a secondary peripheral IV on this patient." "Yes." "He came in dehydrated. His pressure was reading low even after the initial line." "His pressure normalized after fluids." "It did, but the placement was already done and his pressure history, unnecessary procedure. Document it as a hold order from here forward." He set the chart down. "This is a hospital, not a field clinic. We don't order redundant placements because we're worried about hypotheticals." Nora didn't say anything. Webb gave her a look that was just barely too long to be neutral. "I'll be reviewing your orders through the end of the week." He left. Nora looked at the patient, who was watching her with the particular expression of someone who'd just witnessed an interaction they weren't sure how to categorize. "He always like that?" she asked. The patient thought about it. "Pretty much." She nodded, made a note, and moved on. By the end of her first week, Nora had developed a working understanding of the department's ecosystem. Webb ran the clinical floor the way certain men of a certain seniority ran things, not through excellence, which he may or may not have possessed, but through the accumulated weight of being there longest and knowing who to call. He had the department chief's ear. He had a running list of opinions about nursing overreach that he aired in the break room with enough frequency that the other nurses had stopped responding to them. Jess Okafor had learned to root around him. Sandra Pruitt had learned to document everything he said in writing. Nora had learned to watch. She saved a pediatric patient on day 4 by catching a medication interaction that had been logged but not flagged, a dosing error that would have compounded with the child's existing prescription. She didn't make a scene of it. She corrected the order, notified the attending, and filed the incident note. The attending said thank you. Webb, who had been the one to approve the original dosage, didn't mention it again. She reconfigured the trauma cart layout in Bay 3 after noticing that the positioning of the laryngoscope tray required a left-handed reach that added 3 seconds in a critical moment. She didn't ask permission. She just did it, quietly, on a slow Tuesday. Sandra noticed 2 days later and didn't say anything, but the next morning the other 3 carts had been reorganized the same way. She didn't talk about her past. She didn't talk about where she'd been or what she'd done. When people asked about her experience, and they asked because there was something about the way she moved and worked and read a room that didn't match her resume, she gave them the abbreviated version. Mobile contracts, ER rotations, overseas work. On her 9th day, she ran a code on a 43-year-old construction worker who came in without a pulse after a fall from a scaffold. She ran it without flinching, without second-guessing, without the half-second of hesitation she sometimes saw in residents who were technically competent but hadn't yet learned how to be certain under pressure. The man survived. He was in the ICU 2 floors up, breathing on his own, when Nora clocked out at 7 p.m. Webb's review came back the following morning. She heard about it from Jess, who'd heard about it from Sandra, which meant by the time it reached Nora, it had already passed through at least 2 people who understood what it meant. He flagged your last 3 intervention logs, Jess said. She wasn't unkind about it. She was just saying the thing that needed to be said. Called them procedurally inconsistent with standard departmental protocol. Which procedures? The IV placement, the medication flag, and apparently the cart reorganization. Jess looked at her. He's saying you made unilateral decisions outside your scope of practice. Nora set down her coffee. I caught a dosing error. I know. That child would have... Nora. Jess's voice was quiet. I know what you did. Most of us know what you did. But Webb has standing in this department and you've been here 9 days and that's the situation. It was the situation. Nora understood it. She'd been in environments where competence and authority didn't overlap, where the person with the most official weight wasn't necessarily the person with the clearest picture of what was actually happening. She knew how those environments worked. She'd learned to navigate them. But there was a difference between navigating institutional friction and watching a 3-year-old not receive a medication correction because the attending physician didn't want his initial order questioned. She was still thinking about that when Dr. Calloway called her into the office at 2 in the afternoon. The department chief's office was a small room off the main corridor with a desk that was too big for the space and a window overlooking the ambulance bay. Calloway was sitting behind the desk when Nora came in. She gestured to the chair across from her without looking up from the folder in her hands. Nora sat. I've read Dr. Webb's review, Calloway said. Okay. I've also read your incident logs from the past 2 weeks. She flipped to a page in the folder, including the notation on the pediatric medication interaction from last Thursday. Nora waited. The child's parents filed a formal thank you with the hospital last night. Calloway set the folder down. For the nurse who caught the dosing error. I documented it correctly. You did. Calloway's voice was level. You also reorganized equipment without authorization, ordered interventions beyond standing protocol, and according to Webb, gave him a look on Tuesday that he described as insubordinate. I didn't say anything to him on Tuesday. That was his description. Calloway folded her hands. I'm not going to pretend this department doesn't have dynamics. It does. Webb's been here 14 years and I need him functional, but I also need my nurses to follow process. She paused. I'd like to keep you. You're clearly capable. I need you to be capable within the structure we have. It was a reasonable speech. Nora recognized it as a reasonable speech given by a reasonable administrator trying to thread a needle between 2 things she actually needed. She wasn't angry about it. She understood it. I understand, she said. Good. Calloway picked up the folder again. Webb will continue reviewing your orders through the end of the month. You'll reroute any intervention above standard scope through the senior attending on duty. If there's a conflict, Dr. Calloway. Nora kept her voice even. If I see a medication error, I'm going to flag it. If a patient is in danger, I'm going to respond. I'll document everything. But I can't agree to a process that adds time in a critical moment. Calloway looked at her. With respect, Nora added. There was a silence that lasted several seconds longer than comfortable. That's a very specific line to draw, Calloway said finally. Yes. The department chief studied her for a moment. Where did you work before here? Your resume lists contract work, but the specifics are, I worked in mobile trauma environments, Nora said. High volume, high acuity. I can provide references. I've seen your references. Calloway's eyes stayed on her. They're all out of state. 2 of them are from organizations I can't find a current listing for. Nora didn't respond to that. Okay, Calloway said finally. We'll leave it there for now. She opened the door. Talk to Sandra about your November rotation. And Halstead, try not to give Webb reasons to write reports. It costs me time I don't have. Nora left the office and walked back to the floor. And if anyone had been watching her, they would have noticed nothing. No shift in her posture, no tension in her jaw, nothing that looked like a woman who had just been asked, very politely, to be less than she was. She had heard that request before, in other rooms, from other people, in languages other than English. She had learned eventually that complying with it always cost more than refusing. What she hadn't figured out yet was what refusing would cost her here. 3 days later, a man named Garrett Osei started watching her. She noticed him on a Wednesday afternoon. A civilian in his mid-60s, moving through the corridor near the ER with the particular unhurried ease of someone who wasn't a patient and wasn't in a hurry but wasn't exactly wandering either. He had the build of someone who'd been physically strong for a long time and had stopped trying to prove it. His hair was gray and close-cropped. He wore a hospital badge that identified him as a Veterans Services Coordinator. She didn't think much of it the first time. The second time was Friday, when she was in the break room eating a sandwich at 11:30, and he came in, poured himself coffee, and sat down 2 seats away. "Halstead," he said. She looked up. "Garrett Osee." He extended a hand. "I coordinate the Veteran Care Liaison Program on the 3rd floor." She shook it. "I know who you are. I've seen your badge." He smiled slightly. "How's the department treating you?" "Fine." "Heard some noise about a review process." "People talk." "They do." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "You're from the mobile trauma units." It wasn't a question. She answered it like a question. "That's right." He nodded slowly, looking at nothing in particular. "I spent 22 years as a field medic before I retired. Army. Did 3 tours before I started coordinating evacuation medicine." He glanced at her. "You know what a 68W is?" She knew what a 68W was. It was a combat medic occupational specialty classification. She knew because she had held that classification for 4 years before her unit's role changed, and the classification ceased to cover the scope of what she was actually doing. "Medical specialist," she said carefully. "Right." He nodded again. "I ask because there are things that separate a 68W from someone who learned trauma nursing in a hospital environment. The way they assess a room, the way they move when time matters, the way they're not impressed by the things that impress everyone else." He looked at her directly for the first time. "You have all 3. Nora set down her sandwich. "I'm not here to cause you trouble," Garrett said. His voice was quiet. "I just want you to know that I see what you are. Whatever you want to do with that information is up to you." He finished his coffee, stood up, and left. Nora sat alone in the break room for 2 minutes after he was gone, which was 2 minutes longer than she'd sat still voluntarily in about 3 weeks. She had been careful. She had given no one a real answer. She had kept her record opaque and her manner unremarkable, and her instincts leashed to whatever would pass for ordinary in a standard trauma department. And a 60-something retired field medic had walked in, had coffee, and looked straight through all of it. She was still thinking about that when her pager went off. The call came at 12:47 p.m. Not a page, actually, but an overhead announcement, the kind that used the alert code rather than plain language because whatever was happening, whoever was managing the radio traffic on the other end had decided this was not the moment for plain language. Code yellow. Incoming emergency transport, military vehicle, estimated arrival 11 minutes. Trauma Bay 1. There was a second announcement 15 seconds later. All non-essential personnel to clear the ER main corridor. Security to the ambulance bay. Nora was already moving before the second announcement finished. She got to the trauma bay at the same moment as Marcus Webb, which was unfortunate, and at the same moment as Sandra Pruitt, which was less so. Jess was already inside, pulling equipment. An ER resident named Pauling, 28, competent, easily rattled, was checking the crash cart. "What are we looking at?" Webb asked. "Military transport," Sandra said. "Critical trauma. 1 patient. That's all dispatch gave us." Webb straightened his shoulders in the way he always did when he decided a situation called for visible authority. "Prep for multi-system trauma. I'll take point." Nora pulled gloves, positioned herself at the secondary station where she could see the door and waited. The ambulance bay doors opened at 12:58. What came through was not what any of them had prepared for. There were 4 people. 2 Army transport medics in full gear, a captain in uniform who was already on her radio, and a patient on the gurney who was breathing but barely. A man in his late 50s with the build and the bearing, even unconscious, of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. And beside the gurney, moving with it, attached by a short lead to one of the transport medics, was an 85-pound Belgian Malinois in a military working dog vest. The dog's name, Nora would learn later, was Kodiak. In this moment, she knew exactly what she was looking at. She'd seen it before. A military working dog in protective mode, keyed to a handler or a principal, in a high-stress environment surrounded by strangers. The dog's ears were back. Its tail was low. It was reading the room the same way she was, and it did not like what it was reading. The transport medic holding the lead said, "He's been with the general since the incident. We couldn't separate them. He's—" "Get the dog out," Webb said. "Sir, the dog is—" "Get it out of my trauma bay." The medic looked at the captain. The captain looked at Webb. "The animal has protected status under—" "This is my department," Webb said. He looked at hospital security, a man named Torres who was standing near the door with the expression of someone who did not get paid enough for this. "I need that animal removed." Torres moved forward. Kodiak's head swung toward him, and the sound that came out of that dog's chest, low, flat, completely certain, stopped Torres at 4 feet. "He won't attack without a command," the army captain said, "but he will defend the principal if he reads aggression." "This is insane," Webb said. "I have a patient coding on a gurney." "He's not coding yet," Nora said. Everyone looked at her. She was already looking at the patient. His color was poor, his respiration shallow, but there was a specific thing she was seeing, or not seeing, in the way his chest was moving that she needed 3 more seconds to confirm. "His BP?" she asked one of the transport medics. 88/54, dropped from 96 in the last 6 minutes. "Mechanism of injury?" "Vehicle rollover, high speed. Initial assessment was thoracic trauma, possible internal bleeding." "Halstead," Webb said sharply. "Fall back. I'm running this—" Kodiak took 1 step toward Webb. Not aggressive, not a lunge, just a single, very deliberate repositioning that put the dog squarely between the attending physician and the gurney. Webb stopped. His face went a particular shade of pale. "I need someone who can manage the animal," Webb said, but the confidence had left his voice. Nobody moved. Nobody except Nora, who set down her clipboard, took 3 steps forward, and stopped at the edge of the dog's comfort zone. She could feel the weight of every person in the room on her back. She could feel Webb's eyes and Sandra's and Jess's and the army captain's. She could feel the transport medics wondering if they were about to watch a nurse get her arm removed. She looked at Kodiak. He looked at her. She didn't reach for him. She didn't try to make herself seem small or non-threatening. She just stood there, at the edge of his space, and let him read her the way she was reading him. Then she said, in a voice that was completely flat and completely certain, "Kodiak, medic clear. Stand down." The room went silent. The Belgian Malinois blinked. His ears came forward. He sat. The army captain's radio fell from her hand and hit the floor, and nobody picked it up. "How?" one of the transport medics said, and couldn't finish the sentence. Nora was already at the gurney. "Get me a second large-bore IV," she said, pulling on her stethoscope. "And somebody tell Dr. Webb what a tension pneumothorax looks like on the left side, because that's what's killing this man, and we have about 4 minutes. Nobody in that room moved for a full second after she said it, which was a second nobody had. Then everything broke loose at once. Pauline, the resident, got the second IV line started. Sandra was already calling the chest tray. Jess had the ultrasound rolling before Webb found his voice again, which took longer than it should have. "Attention pneumo would present with—" Webb started. "Absent breath sounds, left side," Nora said, not looking up. "Tracheal deviation starting right. JVD in the neck. His pressure's been dropping 6 points every 2 minutes since they loaded him." She positioned the stethoscope. "Listen." She held it out to him. Webb didn't take it. "Dr. Webb," she said, "just that. No inflection, no edge." He took the stethoscope. He listened. His face did something complicated. "Chest tray," he said. "Already called," Sandra said. The next 9 minutes were the kind that Nora had spent years of her life inside. Minutes where time doesn't slow down the way people who haven't been there imagine it does, where it actually compresses, where everything becomes a sequence of actions that either happen in the right order or don't. And the difference between those 2 outcomes is measured in one specific way. The general's name, she learned from the army captain's clipped briefings while they worked, was Harlan Cross. 4-star, decorated, 61 years old. He had been in the back of a military transport vehicle on a highway outside Fort Carlo when a civilian driver ran a red light at 70 miles an hour, and the physics of that collision had done what physics does. Webb performed the needle decompression. To his credit, he was fast. The rush of air when the needle entered the pleural space was audible, and the general's oxygen saturation began climbing within 90 seconds. Nora monitored the secondary line, watched the pressure numbers, and said nothing else for a while. Kodiak had moved to a corner of the trauma bay. He was sitting upright, ears tracking every sound, eyes on the gurney. Nobody went near him. Nobody tried. At one point, Torres edged toward the door and the dog's gaze shifted to him, and Torres found somewhere else to be. The army captain, her name was Voss, Captain Adrian Voss, stood near the wall with her arms crossed and her jaw set, watching the team work with the expression of someone who had done the math on whether this was going to be okay and was waiting to see if the math was right. When the general's pressure stabilized at 104/70, she exhaled once, quietly, and looked at Nora. Nora was documenting. "He's going to need a chest tube," Nora told Webb. "The decompression bought us time, but there's still fluid accumulation on the lower left. I want to get imaging before we commit to surgery, but I don't think we avoid it." "I'm aware," Webb said. "I'm also seeing something in his right wrist. The way the medics had it splinted, the angle's off. If there's a scaphoid fracture that hasn't been identified, one thing at a time, Halstead." She stopped. Not because he was right. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he wasn't entirely right either. But because she understood that the room still had Webb in it, and Webb had just been told by a nurse with 9 days on the department what was wrong with his patient. And whatever the next 20 minutes needed to be, it didn't need to be a war. She documented the wrist observation in the chart, clearly time-stamped, and left it there. Radiology came down. The images confirmed the pleural effusion and, incidentally, a hairline fracture through the proximal pole of the scaphoid in the right wrist, which would have been missed through the end of the week if it had gone unlogged. Webb reviewed the images without comment. General Cross went to surgery at 2:15. The trauma bay emptied by degrees. Captain Voss stayed until the gurney cleared the doors, then finally uncrossed her arms and looked around at the room in the particular way of someone trying to figure out where to direct something they were feeling. She looked at Nora. "I need your name," she said. "It's on my badge." Voss looked at the badge, read it, looked back up. "Halstead." She said it like she was filing it somewhere. "Who taught you the command?" Nora was pulling off her gloves. "Which one?" "Kodiak's down command. It's not standard civilian K9 vocabulary. The phrasing, I've worked with animals before." Voss watched her for a moment. The captain was maybe 35, with the kind of controlled stillness that came from training rather than nature. "Right," she said. She clearly didn't believe it. She clearly wasn't going to push it. Not right now, not in a trauma bay 20 minutes after her commanding officer had been taken to surgery. "Thank you for what you did in here." "I was doing my job." Voss nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. "Sure." She clipped the lead to Kodiak's vest, said something quiet to the dog in a language Nora didn't recognize but that the dog clearly did, and they both left. Nora stood alone in the trauma bay for about 30 seconds. Then she went to go write her documentation. Webb caught her in the corridor. "My office," he said. "When you're done." "I need to complete the chart first." "When you're done." He said it the way people say things when they've already made up their minds about what the conversation is going to be, and they're just waiting for the other person to arrive so it can happen. Nora had been in enough of those conversations to recognize the tone. She finished her documentation, made sure the timestamps were clean, and went. Webb's office was tidier than Calloway's, which told her something. The desk was arranged with a precision that felt deliberate rather than functional. Things placed where they would look organized rather than where they'd be most useful. He was standing when she came in, which people did when they wanted to frame what was coming as something casual. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. "What you did in that trauma bay today was outside your scope," he said. Nora said nothing. "You directed the diagnostic assessment of a critical patient. You gave instruction to the attending physician. You handled a military working animal without authorization." He paused. And you used a command word that is not in any civilian K9 protocol I'm aware of. The patient's alive, Nora said. That's not the point. It should be. Webb's jaw tightened. It's not your call to determine what the point is. You have been in this department for 11 days. You don't have standing to override the attending on a trauma assessment. I didn't override you. I stated an observation. You told me in front of the transport team and the Army captain and 3 other staff members to tell the attending what a tension pneumothorax looks like. She had said that. That was a direct quote. The patient presented with textbook signs, she said. His pressure was dropping. I know what he presented with. Webb's voice had gone flat and quiet, which was more concerning than when it was loud. What I don't know is what you are, Halstead. I've reviewed your documentation 3 times now. You move in a way that no mobile trauma contract explains. You read patients like you've been doing this for 20 years, but you're what, mid-30s? And you knew a military working dog's command protocols. He stopped. Where did you actually work before this? The room was very still. I've answered that question, she said. Not really. She met his eyes and said nothing. Webb studied her for a moment. I'm filing an additional conduct report, he said, and I'm requesting that Dr. Calloway place you on supervised practice pending a review of your background documentation. He sat down. You can go. She went. She walked to the break room, sat down, poured coffee she didn't want, and stared at the wall for a while. The conduct report was expected. She'd seen it coming since Tuesday. What she hadn't expected was the question at the end. The specific question, delivered in that specific flat tone after Webb had been watching her for 11 days and had just watched her do something in a trauma bay that couldn't be explained by the biography she'd provided. The problem with being good at things, she had learned, was that being good at things was its own kind of signature. She was still thinking about it when Garrett Osei sat down across from her with a cup of tea he'd made from a bag that looked like it had been in the break room cabinet since 2019. Heard it got interesting, he said. Word travels. It's a hospital. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. 4-star general, tension pneumo. And you squared a military working dog in a civilian trauma bay. He raised an eyebrow. That's a lot of interesting. I did my job. You did something, Garrett said. I'm not disputing what it was. He set the cup down. Webb's going after your credentials. She'd already assumed that. I know. He has friends on the credentialing committee. I assumed that too. Garrett was quiet for a moment. There are ways to protect yourself, he said. Documentation is one. Witnesses are another, but the cleanest option... He stopped. Don't. He looked at her. Whatever you're about to say, Nora said. Don't. He sat back. Outside the break room window, an ambulance pulled into the bay with its lights off, which meant whatever was coming in was either stable or already past the point where lights mattered. She watched it without really seeing it. How long have you known? She asked. Garrett didn't pretend not to understand the question. Since day 3, he said. The way you checked the trauma cart in Bay 3 on your first shift. The way you held your hands during the pediatric code, the medication flag. He paused. And the way you walked down the corridor the first morning. Most people don't walk that way anymore after they leave. Some of them do. Some of them. The ones who were in long enough that it became structural. He meant it neutrally. She took it neutrally. I'm not asking you to tell me anything. I want you to know that whatever it is, it doesn't change what I've seen you do in this department. And it doesn't change the fact that Webb is going to try to use the gaps in your record to push you out. And the only thing that closes those gaps is the thing I can't disclose, she said. He nodded. She finished her coffee. It had gone cold. I'll figure it out, she said. I know you will. Garrett picked up his terrible tea. I just want you to know you don't have to figure it out alone. She looked at him. He shrugged. Occupational habit, he said. I spent 22 years making sure people didn't have to die alone. Old habits. She left him there and went back to the floor. The conduct report hit her email at 6:47 p.m., 40 minutes before her shift ended. It was thorough. She'd give Webb that. He documented every interaction, every order, every departure from standard protocol. He'd characterized the Kodiak incident as reckless engagement with a known dangerous animal, and the diagnostic assessment as unauthorized clinical direction of a trauma response. He'd added a note at the end that her background documentation contained several unverifiable references that may warrant formal review by the credentialing committee. She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to her personal email, closed her laptop, changed out of her scrubs, and drove home in the dark. Her apartment was on the third floor of a building 6 blocks from the hospital. She'd taken it because it was close enough to walk and far enough that she couldn't see the parking lot from her window. She made rice and something out of a can and ate standing at the kitchen counter, which she did most nights because sitting at a table for one had never made sense to her. She was rinsing the bowl when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Colorado area code. She looked at it for a second, then answered. Halstead. The voice on the other end was a woman's, crisp, unhurried, the kind of voice that was used to being on a line that might be recorded. This is Captain Voss? Nora set the bowl in the sink. How'd you get this number? Hospital directory. You're listed as staff. She was. She'd forgotten that. General Cross is out of surgery, Voss said. He's stable. The surgical team said the pneumo intervention was what kept him viable for the OR. A pause. That was you. That was the whole team. I watched the team, Voss said. The part that mattered was you. Another pause. Shorter. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I'm not asking on behalf of the Army or anyone official. I'm asking because I was in that room and I need to understand what I saw. Nora waited. The command you used, Voss said. Medic clear. Stand down. That's a 3-part vocalization protocol used in military working dog programs for medical emergency override. It's not in any public training manual. It was developed as an internal protocol for use in forward operating environments. She stopped. The only people who know that phrase are handlers who worked in specific field programs and the medical personnel who were embedded with them. The kitchen was very quiet. Where were you embedded? Voss asked. Nora looked at the window. The parking lot below was empty. A streetlight was doing its flickering thing it did every night around this time, pulsing at irregular intervals like something trying to send a message in a code nobody had transcribed. I appreciate the call, Nora said. I'm glad the general is stable. Halstead? Good night, Captain. She ended the call, set the phone on the counter, stood in her kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the cold tile surface. She had been so careful. She had built the resume, kept the references vague, avoided the specific vocabulary, the specific postures, the specific ways of being in a room that telegraphed what she'd been. And in the space of one afternoon, a Belgian Malinois and a dying general had pulled the first thread. She knew how this worked. She knew what came after the first thread. She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a while, not sleeping, which was not unusual. She was used to the hours between midnight and 3 being the ones where her brain refused the instructions she gave it. She had been used to that for years. At 2:18 a.m., her phone buzzed again. A text. Unknown number, different from Voss's. 4 words. We know who you are. Nora stared at the screen until it went dark. Then she got up, went to the window, and looked down at the parking lot. A car she didn't recognize was parked across the street. Dark color, engine off. She couldn't see the plates from the 3rd floor. She watched it for 4 minutes. Then she went to the closet, moved the box on the top shelf, and checked the item underneath it, the one she'd brought with her from her last placement and had sincerely hoped she would never have to look at again. It was still there. She put it back, replaced the box, and went and sat on the edge of her bed. Whatever she'd thought she was leaving behind when she drove into Callaway Regional's parking lot in the snow, she understood now, with the particular cold clarity that had kept her alive in rooms worse than this one, that it had not stayed where she'd left it. It had followed her here, and someone, she didn't know yet who or why or what they wanted, had just decided to let her know that. She didn't sleep after that. She sat on the edge of the bed until 4 a.m., running through what she knew, which wasn't much, and what she could reasonably infer, which was more useful. The text had come 2 hours after Voss's call. That timing wasn't coincidental. Either someone had been monitoring Voss's communication, or someone inside the hospital had been watching the trauma bay incident and had made their own calls afterward. Neither option was comfortable. The car across the street was gone by 4:30. She checked twice, which meant whoever sent the message wasn't interested in immediate confrontation. They were interested in letting her know she'd been seen. That was a specific choice. People who wanted to act didn't announce themselves first. People who announced themselves first wanted something. They wanted her scared or compliant or running. She had learned, in places where the stakes for getting that calculus wrong were measured in body counts, that the worst thing you could do with that kind of message was exactly what it wanted you to do. She made coffee at 5. She was back at Callaway Regional by 6:15. The day started ordinary enough, which she didn't trust. Jess was on the morning shift. Sandra had the overnight handoff. The ER was running at medium volume. A chest pain workup in Bay 2, 2 pediatric cases in the lower acuity wing, a 40-year-old woman with a suspected DVT who was calm about it in a way that worried Nora more than panic would have. She worked through the morning with her head down and her attention split, half on the patients in front of her, half on the background noise of the department, the way she'd always worked in environments where the threat wasn't only in the room you were currently standing in. Webb wasn't on until noon. That gave her a window. At 9:15, she went to the 3rd floor on her break, to the small office at the end of the Veteran Services corridor where Garrett Osei kept his hours. He was already there. He had a paper cup of coffee and a folder open on his desk and the look of someone who had also not slept much. "You heard," she said. "Voss called the hospital administrator this morning," he said. "Officially, on behalf of General Cross." He closed the folder. "She's requesting a full review of the trauma response and asking for the name of the nurse who managed the K9 and identified the pneumothorax." Nora sat down. "Is that a problem?" "On its own, no. The general's alive and the army is grateful, and that's the kind of attention hospitals like." Garrett picked up his coffee. "The problem is that Webb filed his conduct report last night, and Callaway received it this morning before Voss's call came in. So now Callaway has 2 things on her desk that are both about you, and they are pulling in opposite directions." "What's she going to do?" "I don't know yet. She's meeting with the board at 11. He looked at her directly. "The conduct report mentions the unverifiable references. It uses that phrase explicitly. The credentialing committee is going to want to open a formal inquiry." Nora looked at the window. Outside, the sky was flat gray, the kind that meant snow or the threat of it. "There's something else," Garrett said. His voice changed slightly. Not softer, but more careful. "One of the transport medics who came in with the general yesterday, specialist named Rourke, he filed a supplemental incident report this morning with the Army's medical liaison." "About what?" "About you." He paused. "Specifically about the K9 command." He corroborated Voss's description and added that the phrasing you used is classified under a specific training program designation. He stated in the report that the only personnel with access to that command set are documented participants in forward-embedded medical programs under a specific operations classification. He put the folder down. "He's asking the Army liaison to cross-reference personnel who held that designation against your name." The room was very still. "They'll find it," Nora said. Garrett nodded. He said nothing else. "How long?" she asked. "Cross-referencing a classification file like that, if they have the right access and they're moving fast, which they will for a 4 stars attending medic." He stopped. "Hours. Maybe less." She had known, somewhere beneath the part of her that had spent 2 years carefully constructing a life that didn't include what came before, that this was always one of the ways it could end. Not the text message. That was still unresolved, still sitting somewhere in the back of her mind like a door she hadn't opened yet. But the record. The record had always been the thing. You could change your location and your job and the name you put on your badge, but you couldn't change what the record said. And the record said things she had never intended for a civilian hospital credentialing committee to read. "Garrett," she said. "Yeah. When it comes up, whatever they find, I need you to know that nothing I did in this department was dishonest." He looked at her steadily. "I know that. The references are real. The experience is real. I have the clinical qualifications. She stopped. There wasn't a clean way to finish the sentence that didn't require saying the thing she hadn't said to anyone here. "You had reasons for the gaps," Garrett said. "Yes?" He nodded. "Okay." He picked up his coffee again. Go do your job. Whatever comes through that liaison, it's going to take the time it takes. You being useful on that floor today is better than you sitting in this office worrying about paperwork." She went back down. At 10:50, the DVT patient in Bay 4 developed sudden onset shortness of breath and dropped her oxygen saturation to 88%. Nora was closest. She called it before the monitor alarmed. She'd been watching the woman's breathing pattern change for 6 minutes, waiting, and had the crash team in the room in the time it took the monitor to catch up to what her eyes had already told her. It was a pulmonary embolism. The attending on duty, a hospitalist named Dr. Farida Nassim, who Nora had worked with twice and found direct and efficient, ran the response without ego. They worked together cleanly. The patient stabilized. Nassim caught Nora's eye across the bed when the numbers came back up and gave her a single nod, the kind that didn't need words. She documented. She moved to the next patient. At 12:08, Webb arrived. He walked through the ER with the deliberate pace of someone who had made decisions and was now in the process of enacting them. He went directly to the nursing station, spoke briefly to Sandra, too low for Nora to hear across the floor, and then looked toward where Nora was working in Bay 2. She looked back at him. He went into his office. Sandra came over 2 minutes later. Her expression was the carefully neutral one she used when she was about to say something she wasn't personally responsible for. "Dr. Calloway wants to see you at 1 o'clock, she said. "I have a patient in Bay 2. She knows. 1 o'clock. Nora looked at Bay 2, where a 19-year-old with a broken collarbone from a dirt bike accident was watching her with the mild anxiety of someone who couldn't tell if something was wrong or if nurses always looked like that. She smiled at him. "We'll get your imaging sorted before I have to step out. Sound good?" He nodded. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," she said, and went to order the scan. At 12:45, while the collarbone was in radiology and Nora was updating her notes at the station, Jess appeared beside her and set a coffee down without being asked. "Webb's been in Calloway's office since 11:30, Jess said, keeping her voice low. "The radiology charge nurse told me someone from an Army liaison office called the hospital main line this morning." Nora kept her eyes on the screen. "Also, Nassim is telling people you called the PE before the monitor did," Jess added. She apparently described it as the most useful nursing I've seen in this department in 3 years. And she is not a person who says things like that casually. "Good for Nassim," Nora said. "Nora." Jess's voice dropped further. "Whatever is happening with your paperwork, and I don't know what it is, and I'm not asking, there are people on this floor who are going to stand behind you. I want you to know that." Nora finally looked at her. Jess shrugged, slightly defensive, like she was embarrassed to have said something kind out loud. "I'm just saying." "Thank you," Nora said. She meant it. She went to Calloway's office at 1 o'clock. Webb was already there. He was sitting in the chair against the wall, which told her the geography of this meeting had been arranged in advance. Calloway was behind her desk. There was a third person in the room that Nora didn't recognize. A man in a suit, mid-40s, with the particular bearing of someone from administration rather than medicine. He introduced himself as Harold Fitch, the hospital's legal and compliance director. Nora sat in the remaining chair. "Thank you for coming," Calloway said, which was a way of starting a meeting like this that Nora found vaguely ominous, because nobody said thank you for coming to a meeting you had been told to attend. "Of course," Nora said. "I'll be direct," Calloway said. "We've received Dr. Webb's conduct report. We've also received a call this morning from an Army medical liaison officer requesting clarification on your employment documentation." She folded her hands. "The liaison indicated that your name may appear in a restricted personnel classification that our credentialing committee was not informed of during your hiring process." "That's possible," Nora said. Calloway paused. "That's your response?" "It's accurate." Fitch cleared his throat. "Ms. Halstead, if your background contains classified elements that weren't disclosed during the credentialing process, the hospital has a liability exposure that I need to understand." "My clinical qualifications are complete and accurate," she said. "Everything I listed is verifiable. The references exist. The training certifications are real. There are elements of my work history that fall under restricted classification, which means I couldn't list them. Not that I invented substitutes for them. That's a distinction that sounds reasonable, Fitch said carefully. But from a compliance standpoint, she commanded a military working dog, Webb said. His voice was controlled, but the control was doing visible work. In my trauma bay, using classified command protocols, and identified a pneumothorax that he stopped. That the patient survived because of, Calloway said quietly. Webb's jaw moved. That's not the relevant. General Cross's office contacted us this morning, Calloway said. Officially. Captain Voss submitted a formal commendation for the trauma response yesterday, specifically naming the nursing intervention. She glanced at Nora. The Army is grateful. The General's family is grateful. His chief of staff called me personally at 8 a.m. The room shifted slightly. Nora felt it. That doesn't resolve the documentation issue, Fitch said. No, Calloway agreed. It doesn't. She looked at Nora. I need to know who you are, not for the paperwork. I need to understand what we have in this department. It was the most direct thing Calloway had ever said to her. Nora held it for a moment. Then there was a knock at the door. Calloway frowned. I said I wasn't to be... Her assistant opened the door 6 inches. I'm sorry, Dr. Calloway. There's an Army officer here. He says it's not a request. The door opened the rest of the way before Calloway could respond. The man who came in was in dress uniform, which was not common in the corridors of Calloway Regional Medical Center and had the effect of making the room feel immediately smaller. He was a colonel. Nora read the insignia without meaning to. The habit was too old. And he was maybe 50, with a face that had been out in weather for most of those 50 years. He carried a manila folder, and he didn't apologize for interrupting. Dr. Calloway, he said, Colonel Drew Maddox, Army Personnel and Medical Records. I apologize for arriving without appointment. I assure you this won't take long. He looked at the room. His eyes found Nora and stayed there. Specialist Halstead. Nora had not been called that in 2 years. Something tightened in her chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the particular weight of being known by a name she'd laid down deliberately. Colonel, she said. Webb turned to look at her, slowly, like someone recalibrating. You have her file, Calloway said. It wasn't a question. I have what I'm authorized to share, Maddox said. He put the folder on the desk but didn't open it. I'm here because General Cross's office made a request this morning, and because what happened in this hospital yesterday involves personnel and protocols that fall under my office's purview. He looked at Calloway. I'm not here to cause disruption. I'm here to clarify a record. Clarify what specifically? Fitch asked. Maddox looked at him without warmth. The clearance level of the person you've been reviewing for conduct violations. He finally opened the folder. Nora Halstead, civilian designation, emergency nursing, prior designation. He stopped. He looked at Nora. Do you want me to continue? The room was completely silent. Nora thought about the 9-day-old version of herself walking into this hospital in the snow, hoping for ordinary. She thought about the text message she'd received at 2 a.m. and the car she couldn't read from 3 floors up. She thought about Jess putting coffee on her desk, and Garrett and his terrible tea, and a Belgian Malinois sitting down in a room full of armed people because she asked it to. She thought about the conduct report that was sitting on Calloway's desk, characterizing as recklessness the things that had kept people alive. Yes, she said. Continue. Maddox looked back at the folder. Prior designation, 18 Delta, Special Forces Medical Sergeant, attached to a Joint Special Operations Medical Support Unit. 4 years of embedded forward deployment across 3 operational theaters. Recipient of the Meritorious Service Medal, the Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device, and a classified unit citation for actions during a 2021 extraction mission in which she was the sole medical personnel to survive initial contact and subsequently stabilized and evacuated 7 casualties under sustained fire. He closed the folder. She left service with an honorable discharge and a clean record. The gaps in her civilian employment history correspond to operational periods that are classified at a level this hospital does not have clearance to access. Nobody in the room said anything for a long time. Webb was very still. Fitch had his pen capped. Calloway was looking at Nora with an expression that had moved past administrative and into something more human. The conduct report, Maddox said, glancing at the stack of papers on the desk without touching it. I'd recommend reconsidering it. Webb stood up. With respect, Colonel, the Army's assessment of her prior service doesn't change the fact that she operated outside her designated scope in my department. Civilian hospitals have. She identified a tension pneumothorax that your assessment missed and intervened with a military working dog that your security team couldn't approach, Maddox said, in a theater she wasn't trained for, using skills she was. He wasn't unkind about it. He also wasn't soft. She saved a 4-star general's life. The Army doesn't take that lightly. Webb sat back down. I'm not here to dictate how you run your department, Maddox told Calloway. I'm here because the general's office wanted her record clarified, and because there are individuals outside this hospital who have been attempting to identify Specialist Halstead through back channels. He looked at Nora. That's the second reason I came. Nora went still. Someone sent a query through a third-party contractor 2 days ago, Maddox said, trying to pull your service record through a non-official channel. We traced it. He paused. It originated from inside this facility. The silence was a different quality now. Inside this hospital, Calloway said flatly. Inside this building. We don't have a name yet. We're working on it. Maddox's eyes moved briefly, carefully, to Webb, and then away, which was the kind of look that wasn't an accusation but wasn't nothing either. I'd ask that you limit access to Specialist Halstead's personnel file to essential staff until we have clarity on the source. Calloway nodded. Her face had gone the particular white of someone doing very fast math about something happening in their building that they did not sanction. I'll need to brief my security team, she said. I'll coordinate directly, Maddox said. He gathered the folder. He looked at Nora one more time. You did good work yesterday. She didn't respond to that. He left. The room held the particular heavy silence of 4 people in a space that had just been rearranged. Fitch recapped his pen again. Uncapped it. Capped it. I'll need to review the conduct report in light of... Harold? Calloway said. He stopped. Give us the room. He left. He closed the door carefully behind him, which people did when they understood the conversation they were being excluded from was above their clearance level, even if nobody had used that phrase. Calloway looked at Webb. Webb looked at the wall. The conduct report, Calloway said. I stand by the observations in... Marcus, her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. A decorated combat medic with a classified service record saved a 4-star general's life in our trauma bay, and there is someone in this building who tried to access her personnel file through a black market contractor, and the Army is now involved in a security inquiry inside my hospital. She paused. This is not the moment to stand by your observations. Webb said nothing. I'm suspending the conduct review, Calloway said. I'm pulling your oversight designation on her orders, and I'm going to need you to be very careful for the next several weeks about every decision you make and every document you sign. She picked up the conduct report and moved it to the left side of her desk. We're done here. Webb stood. He picked up his things with the careful movements of a man who understood that the floor had shifted under him and wasn't sure where the solid ground was anymore. He walked to the door. He stopped. I didn't pull her record, he said. He said it to the door. I want that on the table. Noted, Calloway said. He left. Calloway sat across from Nora for a moment in the quiet. I owe you an apology, Calloway said. You were managing your department. I was managing my department by letting a 14-year incumbent bully a new employee who turned out to be... She stopped. I should have looked harder. It's a hospital, Nora said, not an intel office. Calloway almost smiled. Almost. No. She folded her hands. I want to keep you on this floor. I want to give you room to do what you clearly know how to do, but I also need to understand the person who queried your record. Do you have any idea who that might be? Nora thought about the text message. We know who you are. She thought about the car, the specific make she hadn't been able to read, parked at 2 a.m. across from her building. She thought about the 2021 extraction mission Maddox had mentioned without specifics, the one where she had been the sole medical personnel to survive initial contact, and about the fact that not everyone who had been in that theater that night had ended up on the same side of the debrief. I have a guess, she said. Should I be worried? Nora looked at her. Yes, she said. She left the office and went back to the floor because there were still patients and someone had to take care of them. And standing in a corridor worrying about what came next had never been a thing she'd found useful. She worked the rest of her shift with the particular focused calm that she'd developed in places where panic was a liability. Not because she wasn't afraid, because she was in the specific background way that wasn't loud but was always present, but because the work was real and in front of her, and the other thing wasn't. Not yet. At 5:40 p.m., 20 minutes before her shift ended, her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. Different from the one last night. A photo. She opened it. It was a picture of the hospital's main entrance, taken from outside. Time-stamped 18 minutes ago. In the lower right corner of the frame, barely visible at the edge, was the back of a woman in dark scrubs walking toward the ambulance bay doors. It was her. Whoever had taken it was still here. She was standing at the nursing station looking at her phone when the overhead announcement came. Not a code, not an alert, just the neutral voice of the hospital PA system paging a name to the emergency department entrance. Not a patient name. Her name. Nora Halstead to the emergency department entrance. Nora Halstead. She looked up. Sandra was watching her from across the station with an expression that had crossed into something past neutral. Jess had stopped moving. Nora pocketed her phone and walked toward the entrance. The ambulance bay doors were open. Outside, a dark SUV was parked at the curb, not in the ambulance bay proper, but close enough to be deliberate. The engine was running. The windows were tinted. Standing beside it was a man she recognized. She hadn't seen him in 2 years. She hadn't spoken to him since the debrief. She had believed, with the particular bone-deep conviction of someone who'd been told a thing officially and officially accepted it, that he was in a federal detention facility 3 states away. He wasn't. He was standing in the ambulance bay of Callaway Regional Medical Center in civilian clothes, and he was looking at her with the expression of someone who had been looking for her for a long time and was not surprised to have found her. "Hello, Nora," said the man who was supposed to be in prison. His name was Victor Straley. She had known him as a contractor, the polite word for what he'd been, which was a man who moved between official and unofficial channels with the kind of ease that required someone powerful to be deliberately not looking. He had been embedded with her unit for 6 weeks in the 3rd operational theater, the one she didn't say the name of even in her own head if she could help it. He had presented credentials, clearances, a specific set of authorizations that had been verified through proper channels. He had seemed, at the time, like exactly what he said he was. He hadn't been. What he actually was had become clear on the night of the extraction mission, the one Maddox had referenced in Callaway's office without details, the one where Nora had been the sole medical personnel to survive initial contact. What she had understood in the hours after, reconstructing the sequence of what had gone wrong and why, was that someone had passed their route to the opposing element 40 minutes before they moved. There were only 8 people who had known that route. 3 of them were dead. 1 was in surgery. 2 had been cleared by the subsequent investigation. That left 2. She had given her statement. She had laid out the sequence. She had named Straley specifically with the specific evidence she had, which was circumstantial but pointed in one direction with a consistency that the investigating officer had called, in her presence, credible and concerning. 6 months later, she had been informed, through official channels, that Straley had been arrested, charged, and detained pending federal proceedings, and now he was standing in the ambulance bay of a civilian hospital in Colorado, and she had no weapon, and there were people 20 feet behind her inside those doors. "You look like you've seen something surprising," Straley said. He had the same voice, unhurried, slightly amused. She had always found that quality in him alarming and had filed it under professional caution without knowing precisely why until the night everything made sense the wrong way. "How are you out?" she said. "Procedural issues." He said it the way people describe flight delays, a minor irritant, nothing personal. "The charges were built on testimony that had chain of custody problems. My lawyer is very thorough. The testimony was mine." It was. He looked at her without particular hostility, which is a problem we need to discuss. She measured the distance to the SUV. She measured the angle of the bay doors behind her. She looked at the windows of the vehicle, still tinted, engine running, which meant at minimum one other person. She looked at his hands, which were in his jacket pockets, which was information. "We're not going to discuss it here," she said. "No," he agreed. "We're not." He glanced toward the hospital entrance. "I understand you've had a complicated few days. Army involvement, a conduct review, someone querying your personnel file." He paused. "That last one wasn't me, for the record. I didn't need to query it. I already knew where you were." She kept her expression still. "I've known for about 6 weeks," Strail said. "I wasn't in a hurry. I wanted to see what you'd built here first." He tilted his head. "I have to say, the general thing was impressive. That wasn't in my projections." "What do you want?" He looked at her for a moment. The amusement faded, just slightly, not into something aggressive, but into something more honest, which was in some ways worse. "Your testimony is going to be resubmitted," he said. "My lawyer can handle the chain of custody issue, but if you refile with the investigation unit, which I understand Maddox is now positioned to facilitate, the procedural dismissal won't hold. I need you to not do that." "You want me to stay quiet?" "I want you to think carefully about what you're certain of," he said. "You were the sole survivor of a contact situation. You were in shock. You made assessments under extreme stress. Those are facts your testimony acknowledges." He paused. Memory is a complicated thing. She understood what he was doing. He was offering her a reframe, not a threat, not yet, because a threat from him at this stage was a last resort, not an opener. He was offering her a narrative exit. She could decide, voluntarily, that her certainty had been overconfidence. She could decline to refile. She could stay in her quiet life in her civilian hospital and not be the person who stood in front of a federal panel and said the same thing she'd said before. "No," she said. His jaw shifted slightly. "Nora, I'm going back inside," she said. "Don't come to this hospital again." She turned and walked back through the bay doors. She did not run. She did not look back. She walked at the pace she'd always moved at when the thing behind her was a problem for the future version of herself to deal with. Not this one. Not right now in the next 3 seconds. She went directly to the nursing station, picked up the desk phone, and called the number Maddox had left with Calloway's assistant. He picked up on the second ring. "Strail is here," she said. "He's in the ambulance bay. Dark SUV, engine running, at least one other person in the vehicle." There was a short pause. "How long ago?" "I walked away from him 4 minutes ago." "Don't go back outside. We have a liaison officer 10 minutes out. I'll redirect them now. Can you get to a secure internal space?" "Yes." "Do that. Don't talk to anyone on your staff about specifics until I've talked to your administrator. Does Calloway know who Strail is?" "No." "Okay, I'll call her directly." His voice was moving. She could hear it, the background shift of someone already walking. "Nora, he's not going to make a move inside a hospital with Army personnel 10 minutes out. You're safe for now." She noted the "for now" and appreciated that he hadn't hidden it. She went to Garrett's office. He was still there, which she'd counted on. She closed the door and sat down and said without preamble, "The man who burned my unit is standing in the ambulance bay, and he's been out of detention for an undisclosed amount of time, and he knows where I live." Garrett set down his pen. She told him the rest of it quickly, without embellishment, the way she gave field reports. Sequence, key facts, decision points. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on about him, the capacity to absorb information without needing to process it out loud in real time. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The record query," he said, "the one Maddox traced to inside the hospital. He said it wasn't him." "You believe that?" She thought about it. "I think he already knew where I was. Querying my record would have been redundant and left a trail. He's too careful for redundant." She paused. "Which means someone else in this building pulled my record for their own reasons. Or for his." Garrett's expression shifted toward something uncomfortable. "Webb." He said he didn't. "People say things." He seemed genuinely rattled when Maddox was in the room, That could be performance, but his version of rattled didn't look constructed. She shook her head. I don't know. It could be someone we haven't identified. It could be something entirely separate. Garrett stood up. He went to the small window in his office, the one overlooking the parking structure rather than the street, and looked out at nothing for a moment. 22 years in the field, he said, and I still find this kind of thing harder than the physical stuff. He turned back. What do you need? A place to stay tonight that isn't my apartment. He nodded. My sister has a guest room. She's in Marlow Heights, 12 minutes from here. She's used to me calling with odd requests. He was already picking up his phone. I'll text you the address. I don't want to put her in. She was military police for 16 years, Garrett said. She's fine. He looked at her with the direct, unbothered expression of someone who had learned not to waste energy on unnecessary complications. Let people help you. It's a skill. You can develop it. She almost smiled. Almost. Maddox's liaison officer, a sharp-faced woman named Lieutenant Draper, arrived at the hospital at 6:10 p.m. The SUV was gone from the ambulance bay. Draper walked the perimeter with a security officer from the hospital and found nothing except tire marks and a cigarette butt, which she photographed and bagged without comment. Maddox called Calloway directly at 6:30. Nora was not in that conversation, but Calloway found her at 6:50 in the break room and sat down across from her with the expression of someone who had received a significant amount of information in a short time and was still integrating it. Victor Strele, Calloway said. Yes. There's a federal investigation. There's been one. It was disrupted. Maddox's office is working to reinstate it. And this man came to my hospital. He came to my hospital, Nora said. I was the reason. Calloway looked at her for a moment. Is there a physical risk to my staff? Nora considered the question carefully, because Calloway deserved a careful answer and not a reassuring one. His pattern has been information and leverage, not direct action. But he has resources and he's operating outside sanctioned channels, which means his risk profile is harder to predict than it was when he was working within a structure. She paused. I would implement whatever additional security measures your administrator recommends, not because I think an incident here is likely, but because Straley calculates risk and I want the math to stay unfavorable for him. I'm installing badge readers on the ER employee access corridor, Calloway said, effective tomorrow morning. She looked at her hands. And I'm pulling the access logs for the past 2 weeks to identify who queried your personnel file. Nora looked at her. I run this department, Calloway said simply. If someone used hospital systems to access a classified personnel record, I need to know who. The access logs took until 9 p.m. to pull and cross-reference. Nora had gone home, to Garrett's sister's house, a brick bungalow in Marlow Heights, where a woman named Adaeze Osei showed her to a clean spare room and asked no questions and made tea that was considerably better than her brother's, and was sitting on the edge of the guest bed with her shoes off when Calloway called. The query came from a workstation in the medical records annex, Calloway said. Badge access shows it was used at 9:47 p.m. 9 days ago. The badge that logged entry was issued to Dr. Marcus Webb. Nora was quiet. He accessed the workstation, Calloway said. Whether he used it to make the external query personally or whether someone else was there with him, the logs don't distinguish that, but his badge opened the door. Have you told Maddox? I've sent him the log files. A pause. Marcus Webb has been on my staff for 14 years. Nora didn't say anything to that. He's not a bad doctor, Calloway said, and it sounded like something she was telling herself as much as Nora. He's arrogant and territorial, and he doesn't handle being wrong well, but I didn't think... She stopped. I didn't think he would do something that could put a staff member in danger. He may not have understood what he was doing, Nora said. If Strail approached him, found him as a useful point of access, Webb might have provided information without understanding who he was handing it to. That's generous. It's possible, she said. That's all I'm saying. She heard Calloway exhale. I've suspended him pending the investigation. Administrative leave effective tomorrow. I told him it was related to the conduct report review. Another pause. I didn't tell him about the access logs. Good. Lieutenant Draper recommended against it. She's right. There was a brief silence on the line. Outside the window of Garrett's sister's spare room, a dog was barking somewhere down the street. A regular, bored bark. Not urgent. Just a dog being a dog in a neighborhood that didn't know any of this was happening. Get some rest, Calloway said. Come in at 9 tomorrow. I want you on the floor, not hiding. She ended the call. Nora lay back on the bed without bothering with the blanket and stared at the ceiling. Webb hadn't pulled her record because he was malicious. That was her read, and she was fairly confident in it. He'd done it because he was a man who felt his authority threatened by someone who turned out to be better at the thing he'd built his identity around. And he'd gone looking for ammunition, and in looking he'd made contact, probably without knowing it, with something considerably more dangerous than a credentialing complaint. That was the particular tragedy of small men making large mistakes. They rarely understood the full weight of what they'd set in motion until it had already moved. Webb was suspended by morning. She knew because Jess texted her at 7:15. A short message, no details, just, "He's out on leave, no explanation given, the floor is weird. Are you coming in?" She came in at 9 as Calloway had asked. She put on her badge, walked through the ER entrance, and went to the nursing station. Sandra looked at her. "Good," Sandra said. "You're here." It wasn't warmth exactly. Sandra didn't really do warmth, but it was something. The day was busy, which helped. There was a multi-vehicle accident on the interstate that sent 4 patients to the ER in a 2-hour window, and Nora worked 2 of them simultaneously with Nassim, who had apparently decided in the wake of the PE save and whatever had filtered through the department's informal information network that Nora was worth standing next to in a crisis. They worked without wasted motion. 2 of the 4 patients went straight to surgery. 1 was stabilized and admitted. 1 was discharged by noon. At 2 p.m., Maddox came back. He came without the dress uniform this time, which made him look like a different person, still completely identifiable as military to anyone who knew what to look for, but less formally declarative about it. He brought Lieutenant Draper. He asked to use Calloway's conference room, and Calloway gave it to him without hesitation. Nora was included in the meeting. So was Garrett. Calloway sat at the head of the table with her hands folded. "We traced the external query," Maddox said. "The one sent from the hospital workstation 9 days ago. It went through a civilian data brokerage firm that contracts with several industries. The firm has a contact inside a federal records management office who has, on multiple occasions, pulled restricted military personnel files for outside clients." He set a printed document on the table. "The client on this query was listed under a corporate shell. We've identified the shell as connected to Straley's legal team." "Webb didn't know what he was accessing," Nora said. "That's our assessment too," Maddox said. "He went looking for your employment history through what he thought was a commercial background check service. He didn't know the service was a Strel-connected data pipeline." He paused. "Which doesn't excuse it, but it changes the criminal exposure." "What happens to Webb?" Calloway asked. "That's a hospital matter. From our side, if he cooperates fully with the investigation, and he's been notified this morning that we need his cooperation, his involvement ends there." Maddox looked at Calloway. "We're more interested in what Straley was trying to accomplish." "He wanted me to recant," Nora said. "He wanted more than that," Maddox said. He looked at her steadily. "The extraction mission in 2021. 3 members of the opposing element who were responsible for the initial contact. They were never identified. You named Straley as the source of the route compromise. He was the only named subject in your testimony, but you noted in your original statement that you believed the route was passed by more than one person." "I did," she said. "I didn't have specific evidence for the others." "Straley has been building a network since his release," Maddox said. "We think the legal maneuver that got him out wasn't just about avoiding prosecution. It was about getting out before a broader investigation started, because the federal unit handling his case was getting close to the other names." He paused. "Your testimony, refiled with the current investigation unit, doesn't just close his case. It opens the network. The room was very quiet. "He didn't come here just to silence you," Garrett said. "No," Maddox agreed. "He came here to find out how much she knew and whether she'd be willing to disappear quietly, if the answer to both was the wrong thing for him." He didn't finish the sentence. Nora understood the unfinished sentence. "How close is the investigation?" she asked. "Close enough that Straley is moving fast and making visible plays," Maddox said, "which means he's concerned, which is useful." He looked at her. "I want to ask you formally, on record, whether you're willing to refile your testimony and cooperate with the expanded investigation." The room looked at her. She thought about the text message. "We know who you are." She thought about the photo of herself walking into her own hospital. She thought about the ambulance bay and Straley's voice, unhurried, offering her a way out that wasn't really a way out. She thought about the 7 casualties she had carried out of the worst night of her life, one by one, in the dark. "Yes," she said. Maddox nodded. He made a note. He looked around the table. "The investigation becomes active and classified as of this meeting. I'd ask everyone in this room to treat what's been discussed as need to know only." He gathered his documents. "We'll have formal statements for you to sign this week, Specialist Halstead. In the meantime," he glanced at Calloway, "I'd keep the badge readers on." He and Draper left. The 4 of them remaining, Nora, Garrett, Calloway, and the particular weight of everything that had just been said, sat in the conference room for a moment without speaking. "I owe you more than an apology," Calloway said. She was looking at the table. "I owe you better judgment." "You ran your department on the information you had," Nora said. "Webb's conduct report should never have—" "It's done," Nora said. Not harshly, just finished. Calloway nodded. She looked tired in the specific way of administrators who discovered that the things happening inside their walls were larger than their walls. "What do you need from me?" "Let me work," Nora said. "That's all." She went back to the floor. At 4:30, she was at the nursing station updating charts when her phone buzzed. She expected Maddox. She expected Garrett. She expected, distantly, another message from a number she didn't recognize with another piece of information designed to remind her she was being watched. It was none of those. The message was from Lieutenant Draper. 4 sentences. Straley's SUV located at a long-term parking structure near the airport. 1 occupant inside, not Straley. Straley's phone last pinged a cell tower 2 blocks from your current location 40 minutes ago. Do not leave the building. Nora read it twice. She looked up. Jess was across the station typing something. Sandra was on the phone. The ER was its regular late afternoon volume. Not quiet, not chaos, just the ordinary hum of people being sick and frightened and needing help. She looked at the entrance. The automatic doors opened. A man in a delivery uniform walked in carrying a sealed medical supply box, headed for the receiving desk, completely ordinary. Behind him, the doors stayed open for 1 additional second. In that second, she saw a figure standing on the far side of the ambulance bay. Not near the entrance, not moving toward it, just standing, in the particular posture of someone who wasn't there by accident and wasn't in a hurry and wanted to be seen. Not Straley, someone she didn't recognize. And that, she understood with the cold and absolute clarity of someone who had spent 4 years learning to read the difference between a threat that was visible and one that was positioned was considerably worse. She didn't move toward the entrance. That was the first decision, and it was the right one. She stepped back from the nursing station, kept the figure in her peripheral line of sight, and texted Draper without looking at her phone. Unknown male, ambulance bay, standing stationary, not approaching. I'm inside. The reply came in 11 seconds. Stay where you are. Do not approach exits. Units redirecting now. Jess looked up from her workstation. She read something in Nora's posture. Not panic, because Nora wasn't panicking, but the particular quality of stillness that isn't relaxation. And she didn't say anything. She just moved around the station to stand closer, which was the most useful thing she could have done without being asked. Nora looked at the entrance again. The figure was gone. That was worse. A visible threat had a location. A threat that moved was a threat with a plan. She found Sandra. I need you to quietly make sure all staff are inside and accounted for. Don't announce it. Just check. Sandra looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then she picked up the internal phone and started making calls. The next 14 minutes were the longest kind. The kind where you are in a room full of ordinary activity and you are the only person who knows something is wrong, and you have to hold that knowledge without letting it change the texture of the room. Because if it changes the texture of the room, then the patients feel it and the staff feel it, and the thing you're trying to contain stops being contained. A mother was checking in her son at the front desk. He had a broken finger from soccer practice, and he was trying very hard not to cry about it. A man in his 70s was being wheeled from Bay 1 towards radiology by a transport aide who was telling him a story about his daughter's first car. The ordinary machinery of a hospital running itself forward. Nora stayed visible, stayed in the middle of the floor, and waited. Draper called at 4:52. "We have him. Parking structure, east stairwell. He's not Straley. He's a courier, paid in cash 3 days ago to stand in a specific location for 60 seconds and then leave. Burner phone. No ID beyond his driver's license. We're processing him now." A pause. "It was a test. He wanted to see if I'd run," Nora said. "That's my read. He's measuring your response pattern." Draper's voice was careful and clipped, which means he doesn't know you as well as he thinks he does. Or he's building towards something and needed a data point. Also possible. A pause. "We have units on a 2-block perimeter. Straley's phone went dark 40 minutes ago, which means he either switched devices or he's in a structure that blocks signal. We're pulling camera coverage now." She stopped. "Nora, the reinstatement request went through an hour ago. Maddox filed it officially with the Federal Investigation Unit. Strahl knows, or he will know within hours. Whatever he's going to do, tonight is when his options start closing." Nora understood what that meant. Cornered wasn't the same as defeated. Cornered was the most dangerous version. "I'm not leaving the hospital," she said. A brief pause. "I was going to suggest the same thing. We'll have an officer in the ER by 6. She ended the call and went back to work because there was nothing else to do that was more useful than that, and because standing in a corridor waiting for something to happen was a specific kind of psychological warfare she had refused to lose to before. The broken finger boy turned out to have a spiral fracture that would need splinting rather than buddy taping, and his mother was taking the news with the barely controlled anxiety of a parent who had decided while driving over that it was minor and was now recalibrating. Nora sat with them for 4 minutes longer than strictly necessary. She explained what the splint would involve. She showed the boy. His name was Danny. He was 9. He had grass stains on his shin from the game, where the fracture was on the x-ray, and told him it was a clean break, and clean breaks healed fast in 9-year-olds, which was true. He forgot to be scared while he was looking at his own bones. She had learned a long time ago, and in conditions that had nothing in common with this exam room, that the most important moments in medicine were not always the ones with the highest stakes. Sometimes the most important moment was 4 minutes with a 9-year-old and his worried mother, and the difference between leaving the room too quickly and staying long enough to make it actually okay. She stayed long enough. At 5:40, Garrett appeared at the nursing station. He looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had information and was deciding how to present it. "The Federal Investigation Unit," he said quietly. "They've been moving since Maddox filed the reinstatement. Apparently, the moment the filing was confirmed, it triggered a parallel warrant process that had been held pending Maddox's authorization. For what? Straley's legal team. 2 of his attorneys have been under investigation independently, not for his case, but for the data brokerage network he was using, the firm that pulled your personnel file." Garrett kept his voice low. "The warrants executed at 5 p.m. Their offices in Denver and a satellite office in Colorado Springs." He paused. "They also executed a search of a residential property in Fort Carlo." She looked at him. "Registered to a shell company," he said. "But the property has had consistent utility usage since October. Maddox thinks it's been Straley's base since he was released." He paused again. "He wasn't in it when they went in, but there was a significant amount of material, documents, communications, records of transactions." He stopped, then said the next part carefully. "Including communications about multiple individuals from your 2021 unit, not just you." The weight of that settled. He had a list, she said. It appears so. She thought about what Maddox had said, that her testimony didn't just close Straley's case, it opened the network. She thought about 3 unnamed members of an opposing element who had known a route that only 8 people had been given. She thought about the 7 casualties she had moved through the dark one by one, and the specific mathematics of why there had been 7 rather than 8. Where is he, she said. They don't know yet. At 6:15, the Army liaison officer Draper had promised appeared at the ER entrance, a young sergeant named Tully who looked about 24 and had the specific attentive quality of someone who'd been told to take the assignment seriously and had decided to take that instruction literally. He positioned himself near the waiting area with his hands behind his back and watched the entrance without appearing to watch it, which was a skill that took some people years to develop. Nora noticed he'd developed it. The department ran its evening rhythm. Shift change came at 7. The overnight crew filtered in. Nora should have gone home at 6, but she stayed, and Calloway, who appeared briefly at 6:30 to check the floor, looked at her and said nothing about it. At 7:48, Draper called again. We have him, she said. Nora stopped walking. Airport. Not the main terminal. The private aviation facility on the south end of the field. He was in a vehicle registered to a third-party logistics company that had a legitimate pickup scheduled. He was in the trunk. A pause. He was attempting to leave. She let out a breath. He's in federal custody as of 7:36, Draper said. This is an official notification that Victor Straley has been taken into custody under the reinstated federal investigation warrant and multiple additional charges related to the data brokerage network. He will not have access to outside communication pending arraignment. Her voice was precise and professional, but there was something underneath it that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite relief and was probably, Nora thought, the particular feeling of something finally closing. Your testimony will be formally requested within the next 72 hours. A federal protective detail will be assigned to you pending the arraignment, after which the threat assessment will be reviewed. Nora was standing in the corridor outside the break room. The hallway was empty. The overhead fluorescent at the far end was doing its usual unreliable flickering. Thank you, she said. You did the work, Draper said. We followed it. She stood in the corridor for a moment after the call ended, not thinking about anything in particular, just standing in the quiet and letting the specific tension she'd been carrying for the past several days, Kitty, and if she was being honest, the past 2 years, find somewhere to go. It didn't disappear. That wasn't how it worked. It just became a different weight, less like something pressing on her chest and more like something she was allowed to put down for a moment and look at. She went to the break room and made coffee and sat down. Garrett found her there 20 minutes later. He sat across from her without asking, which she had come to understand was simply how he operated. He identified where he was needed and appeared there without requiring permission. It was an irritating quality, and she had stopped being irritated by it sometime around day 4. She told him. He listened. He said, "Good," with the particular quietness of a man who knew exactly how much work that word was carrying. What happens now? He asked. Testimony, probably more than once. The network investigation will take time. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. They'll want everything I have on the other names. I only had circumstances, not evidence, but circumstances are a starting point. And here? She looked at the table. Calloway wants me to stay, she said. I know, she told me. Webb is gone for now. There will be a formal investigation into the access logs. His involvement with the data query was probably ignorant rather than complicit, but ignorance still has consequences and he should face them. She paused. He's a good doctor who was a bad leader who made a frightened decision when he felt threatened, and that's not excusable, but it's also not irredeemable. That's a judgment someone other than me should make. Garrett nodded. And you? She didn't answer immediately. She had come to Calloway Regional looking for ordinary, a place to be a nurse without the other thing pressing in from the edges. She had thought, in the particular optimistic logic of someone who'd been running long enough to believe that you could outrun certain things if you moved fast enough, that ordinary was a choice she could make. It wasn't. She understood that now. Not as a defeat, but as a fact. She was not going to be ordinary. That ship had sailed in a specific operational theater in 2021, and she needed to stop trying to book passage on it. "I'm going to stay," she said, "but not the way I came in. No more abbreviated answers, no more vague references." She looked at Garrett. "If someone asks who I am, I'm going to tell them." He smiled. It was a small one, the kind that didn't need to be bigger. "That's going to be an interesting conversation with some of the residents." "They'll manage." She finished her coffee. She went home, her own apartment, not Garrett's sister's guest room, because Strahl was in custody and the threat assessment had shifted, and she was not going to let the last 2 years of low-level hypervigilance become a permanent posture. She drove herself. She parked in her usual spot. She went upstairs and stood in her kitchen for a moment, just being in her kitchen, which was ordinary and small and entirely hers. She slept without her phone on the nightstand for the first time in a very long time. The next 3 weeks moved in the way that consequential things often move. Not dramatically, but with the particular weight of things that are actually changing rather than just appearing to. The Federal Protective Detail was a young agent named Soo-Jin Park, who was professionally pleasant and personally unobtrusive and spent most of her time in a car outside the building, which was fine. Nora gave her testimony on a Tuesday morning in a federal building downtown, in a room with a recording device and a stenographer and 2 investigators who asked the same questions 6 different ways, because that was how it worked, and she was patient with it. She gave them everything: the route, the timing, the specific sequence of the contact that told her, when she reconstructed it later, exactly when the compromise had to have occurred. The 3 communications she had witnessed between Strahl and parties she hadn't been able to identify at the time, but could now, with the additional context of what the investigators were showing her, place with more specificity. She was in that room for 4 hours. She came out with a headache and went back to work. The network investigation widened. She wasn't privy to all of it. It was a federal matter, and she was a witness, not an investigator. But Maddox briefed her twice more over the following weeks. 2 additional individuals connected to the 2021 contact were identified and charged. The data brokerage firm was shut down. Strahl's legal team was facing their own proceedings, which had the particular institutional poetry of people who had helped a bad actor evade accountability, now facing accountability through the same system they'd helped manipulate. Strahl himself was arraigned on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after his arrest. Nora didn't attend. She wasn't required to, and she chose not to because she had learned over the years that not everything important required her physical presence to be real. She was at Callaway Regional. She was running a code on a 67-year-old man who had collapsed in the parking lot, and she ran it well, and he went to the ICU alive, and that was where she needed to be. She heard about the arraignment from Draper, in a text, at lunch. Strahl entered not guilty. Bail denied. Trial date set for spring. You may be called as trial witness. We'll give you maximum notice. Threat assessment formally downgraded. The detail will step back tomorrow. She texted back, "Thank you." She ate her lunch. Webb's situation resolved in the way that institutional investigations involving 14-year veterans tended to resolve, not quickly and not dramatically. He was placed on extended administrative leave pending the completion of 2 separate reviews. One internal, related to the conduct report and the questionable access log entry, and one external, related to the federal investigation into the data brokerage network. He was not charged criminally. The investigator's assessment was that his use of the background check service had been reckless and inappropriate but not intentionally connected to Strahl's operation. He resigned in February. Nora was not asked to comment on his resignation, and she didn't volunteer to. She had no satisfaction in it, not the kind she might have expected. He had made her life difficult and then made it dangerous, in roughly that order, and she couldn't find it in herself to feel triumphant about a man who'd made his own bed through a combination of arrogance and incaution. What she felt was something closer to tired, which was more honest than triumph, and probably more appropriate. Callaway promoted her in March. It was not a grandiose promotion. There was no ceremony. Callaway called her into the office one morning and slid a folder across the desk and said, "I'm creating a trauma training lead position. It's clinical and educational. You'd take primary responsibility for developing protocols and training the ER nursing staff in high-acuity intervention techniques. The pay change is in the folder." She paused. I should have found a better use for you from the beginning. Nora picked up the folder. You found a reasonable use for me. I was managing politics instead of running a department, Calloway said. There's a difference. She leaned back in her chair. The residents already think you're somewhat mythological. Nassim has been citing you in case reviews. I know, Nora said. It's slightly embarrassing. Get used to it. Calloway almost smiled. The same almost smile Nora had seen a handful of times, which she had come to understand was simply the size that Calloway's smiles went. Say yes or don't, but say something. Yes, Nora said. She took the folder and went back to the floor. She told people who she was, after that, in the way she'd told Calloway she would. Not performing it, not making announcements, but not hiding it either. When residents asked why she moved differently from other nurses, she told them. When staff asked about the Kodiak incident, which had acquired the particular mythological quality of an ER story that gets told and retold and slightly enlarged with each telling, she told them the accurate version, which was more interesting than the legend anyway. It was uncomfortable initially. Saying true things out loud always carried the risk of being known, and being known carried the risk of being judged. And she had spent 2 years building very specific defenses against both. She dismantled them slowly and with the same deliberate precision she brought to everything else, which meant imperfectly, with residual places where the instinct to deflect was stronger than the decision not to. Garrett noticed. He didn't comment on the progress, only on the specific moments it showed up. A morning when she told a medical student directly the full version of what she'd done in the field and why it was relevant to the patient in front of them, and Garrett materialized with coffee afterward and said only, "Good," in the tone of someone checking a box on an internal list. She told him once that he was annoying. He agreed with equanimity and refilled her coffee. In April, General Cross came back to the hospital. He came on his own, in civilian clothes, without a formal visit request. He just appeared at the ER entrance one Wednesday afternoon and asked for Nora Halstead. Tully, who had, somewhat mysteriously, become a semi-regular presence in the department, which Nora suspected Draper had arranged, found her in Bay 3 and said there was someone at the front asking for her. The general looked better than the last time she'd seen him. He had color. He was walking unassisted. He was still carrying the slightly careful quality of someone who'd been reminded that their body had limits, but he was carrying it as information rather than defeat. He was also carrying a Belgian Malinois on a military lead. Kodiak looked at her when she came through the doors. His ears came forward. He remembered you, Cross said. We've been doing his recertification, and every time we ran the medical emergency scenarios, he responded differently when the training staff used the clear command. He paused. So I thought I'd test the theory. Nora crouched down. Kodiak walked to her with his tail moving in the specific, deliberate way of a working dog that had decided someone was acceptable. Not wild or undisciplined, just steady and certain. She put her hand out. He sniffed it. He sat down beside her, which was, for a military working dog, the equivalent of a formal declaration. She looked up at Cross. Thank you, he said. It was the simplest version of the sentence, which made it the heaviest. I was doing my job, she said. Captain Voss tells me that's what you always say. It's always been true. Cross looked at her for a moment. He had the quality of a person who had been in command for a long time and had learned to look at people rather than at their resumes. What happened to you in 2021? He said, and then stopped like he was choosing the next words carefully. That kind of thing leaves a mark. Some people become smaller afterward. You became... He stopped again. I'm not sure of the right word. Available, Garrett said from somewhere slightly behind her. She hadn't heard him arrive, which was either a sign of his skill or her distraction. Cross looked at him. Yeah, he said. That. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. So she stood up and introduced Garrett to the general, and they spent 12 minutes talking about veteran recovery protocols and whether Calloway Regional had the infrastructure to host a pilot program, which it did not currently, but Calloway had been making preliminary calls about funding, and the conversation had the particular forward momentum of something that was going to keep moving after it left this room. That was in April. By June, Callaway Regional had a formal partnership with the Veteran Services Liaison Network that Garrett had spent 3 years trying to get institutional support for. Nora ran the first training session for the ER staff in May. 12 nurses and 4 residents and 2 attending physicians, in a conference room with a whiteboard and several anatomy models and an unofficial appearance by Kodiak, who had become something of a presence at the hospital in the way that certain animals found their way into environments where their usefulness was obvious to everyone except the people writing the liability policies. She taught them the things that weren't in the textbooks, the specific physiological presentation of injuries that emerge hours after trauma rather than immediately. The recognition signs for blast-related neurological damage in patients who appear superficially intact, the way that veterans in pain sometimes present as calm and unresponsive, and how to read the difference between composure and dissociation. The way that certain patients, certain histories, certain experiences needed a different language from the one medical training defaulted to, not because they were fragile, but because the standard language was designed for experiences they hadn't had. She was not a perfect teacher. She was too direct sometimes and not direct enough others. She lost the thread occasionally in the middle of a longer explanation, remembered something specific from a field situation and had to find her way back. She said things that made people uncomfortable, not to provoke them, but because the thing needed to be said, and she hadn't yet fully calibrated the difference between the way she'd communicated in operational environments and the way communication worked in a room full of people whose training had been almost entirely institutional. She was working on it. After the May session, a resident named Quan lingered when the others were clearing out. He was second year, thoughtful, the type who asked good questions and then actually processed the answers instead of using them to ask different good questions. He looked at the whiteboard for a moment before he turned around. "The 2021 extraction," he said. "The one in the news coverage of the Straley case." "Yes." "You were the medical personnel." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I read that 7 casualties were recovered. I was trying to figure out how one person—" He stopped. "I don't know how to ask this without it sounding wrong." She looked at him. "You want to know how I got 7 people out?" "Yeah." She picked up her water bottle from the table. "One at a time," she said. "I got them out one at a time. The same way you'll handle things that are too large to handle all at once, which is by doing the next specific thing that needs to be done, and then the next one, and not looking at the full picture until you have the capacity to." She paused. "Does that answer the question?" He thought about it. "Kind of," he said. "The rest is in the doing, right?" "The rest is always in the doing," she said. He nodded and left. She stood in the conference room alone for a moment. Outside the window, it was one of those June afternoons that Colorado managed occasionally, and not often enough. The sky a specific unclouded blue, the kind that looked like someone had decided to render it at maximum resolution. The parking lot was dull and gray and full of cars. Someone was arguing about a parking spot near the handicapped spaces. A child was walking in holding his mother's hand, looking at the hospital entrance with the particular apprehension of a child who had been told the place wasn't scary but wasn't sure whether to believe it. Ordinary. All of it. Ordinary. She thought about what Garrett had said in April, and what the general had tried to say before him, and what she'd spent 2 years trying to decide about the thing she'd been and the thing she was now, and whether those 2 things were allowed to be the same person. She had come here to put distance between herself and who she'd been. She had understood that project, somewhere underneath the surface logic of it, as a kind of correction, as if the person who had survived that night was a mistake that could be undone by building a quieter life around her. As if the things she knew and the things she could do were something to apologize for, to file under dangerous history, to keep away from the people around her for their own protection. She understood now that she'd had the math backward. The things she knew were not dangerous to the people around her. They were available to them. The trauma protocols she'd refined in operational environments were saving patients who had never been near a conflict zone. The specific language she'd developed for understanding injury and pain was making it possible for veterans in this hospital to feel seen by staff who now knew how to look. The instincts she'd spent years treating as things to suppress were the exact instincts that had put her in the right place at the right moment, when a 4-star general and an 85-pound Belgian Malinois needed someone who wouldn't flinch. She hadn't been running from a version of herself that was too damaged to function. She'd been running from a version of herself she didn't yet know what to do with. She'd figured it out. She picked up her things, turned off the conference room lights, and went back to the floor. Jess was at the station. Nassim was finishing a chart in the corner. Tully had reappeared near the entrance, which made her think Draper was coming by later. Sandra was on the phone with the particular expression that meant whoever she was talking to was not making her job easier. Ordinary. The specific ordinary of this floor, which was not the same as the ordinary she'd driven into that parking lot looking for in the snow, but was something better. Something real and textured and populated with people who knew who she was and had decided that was fine. "We've got a 48-year-old inbound," Jess said without looking up. "Chest pain, onset 40 minutes ago. History of hypertension." "Which bay?" "2. Pauline's prepping." Nora pulled on her gloves. "I'll take point until the attending gets there." "He's 5 minutes out." 5 minutes is enough time to know what we're dealing with. She pushed through the bay door. This is what she knew by then, and what she carried into that room and every room after it, that the thing you've survived doesn't have to be the thing that defines you unless you let it, and that the people who tried to make her smaller had never understood that her size wasn't something they could adjust. That the quiet ones, the people who don't announce themselves, who don't argue for their own credibility, who just do the work and let it speak, are not quiet because they have nothing to say. They are quiet because they're listening to everything, and listening is how you know where you're actually needed. She had been dismissed. She had been reviewed and doubted and handed conduct reports and asked to be less so that someone else could feel like more. She had been threatened by a man who understood that what she knew was going to cost him, and he had been right, and it had. And he was now in a federal holding facility waiting for a trial date while she was in Bay 2 with a middle-aged man who was afraid he was having a heart attack. He was, as it turned out. She knew before the monitor confirmed it because she always knew, and the 5 minutes before the attending arrived were not wasted. They were used. They were all used. That was the thing people missed about the women they underestimated. The time was never wasted. Every moment they spent being dismissed, being overlooked, being handed smaller boxes than they could fill, they were watching and learning and waiting and building toward the moment when the door opened and everything they'd been storing up became exactly what was needed. The quiet ones aren't waiting to be recognized. They're waiting for the moment when recognition becomes irrelevant, because what they've built is so demonstrably real that there's nothing left to argue about. Nora Halstead had been a soldier. She had been a survivor. She was a nurse. And in Bay 2 of Callaway Regional Medical Center, with a 48-year-old man's life in the balance and the attending 2 minutes out, she was exactly enough.